In the passage that we've just read and heard, we truly see the character of Jesus as it clearly demonstrates his love. When we consider who Jesus was and what he might have done, the supreme wonder of what he does here depicts total humility and grace. Jesus knew that his hour of humiliation was near, but he also knew his hour of glory was also near. For many, pride would have taken over and said, "Come, look at this." But no, not for Jesus. With his knowledge and power, he washed his disciples' feet. To wash the feet of the guests at a feast was the job of a slave. The disciples of rabbis were supposed to be at their beck and call, but even they would never have done such a task. In fact, the washing of feet was considered too demeaning for even a Jewish slave. And so a non-Jewish slave was assigned to do the task. It's an amazing thought that Jesus, with his nearness to God, brought him nearer than ever to humankind. In fact, it has been said that no one is closer to humankind who is close to God. There was a legend of St. Francis of Assisi. In his early days, he was wealthy, incredibly wealthy. Nothing but the best was good enough for him. He was the aristocrat of aristocrats, but something was missing, and his heart ached, and there was no peace in his soul. One day, he was out riding alone outside the city when he saw a leper, a mass of sores, a horrible sight. Normally, he would have winced and ignored the person, but something moved within him, and he got off his horse and flung his arms around the leper. And as he embraced him, the leper turned into the figure of Jesus. You see, the nearer we are to suffering humanity, the nearer we are to God. Jesus also knew. He was well aware that he was about to be betrayed, and such knowledge could have easily turned into bitterness and hatred. But it made his heart run out in a greater love than ever. It's an amazing fact that the more men hurt him, the more Jesus loved them. It's so easy and so natural to resent wrong and grow bitter under insult and injury. But Jesus met the greatest injury and supreme disloyalty with the greatest humility and supreme love. Some of you will know of a difficult situation that I'm going through at the moment, and I find it no coincidence that the last two talks have been about seeing trials as tests and loving through difficulties. But there is more in the background of this passage that John omits. And we have to look at Luke's gospel to read of a dispute among the disciples. Who was the greatest? Even within the sight of the cross, the disciples were still arguing. But it may have been this very argument that produced the situation which made Jesus act as he did. You see, the roads of Palestine were unsurfaced and uncleaned. In dry weather, they were inches deep in dust, and in the wet, they were liquid mud. The shoes that they wore were sandals, which gave little protection against the dust or the mud. And that is the reason why there were always large pots of water at the door of a house, where a servant was there with a jug and a towel to wash the soiled feet of the guests. Rather than putting your foot into the basin itself, water was poured over the feet from one vessel and caught in another. Now, Jesus' small company of friends and servants didn't have a servant, Jesus' small company of friends did not have a servant. So the servant chores were shared among them. And for some reason on this occasion, the person forgot his task. So Jesus himself did what none of them was prepared to do. Then he said, "You see what I've done? You call me Lord and Master, and you know you are right, for I am. And yet I'm prepared to do this for you. Surely you don't think a pupil deserves more honor than a teacher, or a servant than a master? Surely if I do this, you ought to be prepared to do it. I am giving you an example of how you ought to behave towards each other. Do you know, this ought to make us think about ourselves. Do we take offense if not acknowledged for an act of service? Do we get upset if somebody does my task? I read a quote worth mentioning. The world is full of people who are standing on their dignity when they ought to be kneeling at the feet of their brethren. I'll say it again. The world is full of people who are standing on their dignity when they ought to be kneeling at the feet of their brethren. So next time someone upsets you or annoys you, picture the Son of God with a towel kneeling at his disciples' feet. Let me stress, though, that our humility does not begin with service. It begins with a readiness to receive it. Now, I've said this before. Often with John, there are two meanings in his writings. The one that is obvious and lies on the surface, and the other which is beneath and needs to be teased out. On the surface, we see a dramatic and unforgivable lesson in humility, but there is more to it than that. Contained here is one difficult passage. At first, Peter refuses to allow Jesus to wash his feet. And Jesus tells him that unless he accepts this washing, then he will have no part with him. Then Peter, in his usual bull in a china shop response, says, "Oh, my hands and my head too." And Jesus responds, "No, just your feet." Now, the difficult sentence is in verse 10. One who has bathed does not need to be washed except for the feet. Beyond doubt, this passage is a reference to believers' baptism. Unless you are washed, you can have no part of me. In a way, Jesus is saying, unless you pass through the waters of baptism, you have no part in the church. Let me explain a little bit more. It was custom that before people went to a feast, they bathed themselves at home. So when they went to the house of the host, they just needed to have their feet washed. So Jesus says to Peter, it is not the bathing of your body that you require. You can do that yourself. What you need is the washing that marks your entry into the household of faith. That's what we saw earlier when Jenny was baptized. And I would challenge any of you here, if you've not been baptized as a believer, please seriously consider it. And the water is still hot. It is also worth explaining another thing. When Peter first refuses to allow Jesus to wash his feet and says that if he does, he will have no part of him, it's as if Jesus is saying, Peter, are you going to be too proud to let me do this? If you are, then you will lose everything. Are we too proud? In the early church, and still today, the way in is in the way through baptism. It is the outward sign of an inward faith. Now, I'm not saying that if you've not been baptized, then you cannot enter heaven. But what I'm saying is that if Jesus said, believe and be baptized, and if he felt it was important that he too was baptized, then don't be too proud to enter by that gate. And so we learn from this passage that we are to be humble and serve one another, to not think that we are above anyone, but to do things without complaining or begrudging a task asked. We need to look at ourselves and ask if our actions or words are what they should be. Are they worthy of a follower of Jesus Christ? Are they worthy to be known as a Christian? If the Son of God came to serve and not to condemn, then so should we serve. I'm going to ask you to do something which could be quite painful if you do it seriously. In the quietness of your own hearts, ask God to reveal areas of your life and my life that needs attention, which needs sorting out. And I want you to ask him for his help to become the person that he wants you to be.